Okay, so good afternoon. My name is Zsolt Enyedi. I'm a researcher at CU Democracy Institute and faculty at CU Vienna. Welcome. This is the session entitled Religion and Ideology in Illiberal Times of a series that has a title Confronting Goliath. This series is organized by my colleague Balint Mikola, and we have every week a session that discusses various topics that are relevant to understand what is happening now in Hungary. As you know, we are in the middle of the election campaign, and we try to make sense of what is happening around us. Now, I think that the title, Goliath, refers to the formidable advantage that Fidesz has in terms of resources and also legal authority over its rivals. But my question that I would like to discuss with our colleagues is whether it has similar kind of advantage when it comes to norms, values, and identities. We all understand, I think, the fundamental power-focused motivation of the government party. And we understand that often office is used in order to enrich themselves. But the question is there anything else beyond that? And in order to understand these questions, we will have experts who know various related phenomena. And the reason why we have this lineup is that we decided to address this question by widening a little bit our horizon. So as opposed to the previous sessions where we had people who were directly working on Hungarian politics, we have here colleagues who are experts on understanding other illiberal cases as well as Hungary. So Putin's Russia, the European and the global radical right. They are knowledgeable about those cases, they are knowledgeable about Hungary, and they are knowledgeable about relationship between politics and religion, and also nationalism. So we will, with that help, we will investigate the role of values, norm, and identities. Our speakers are Anton Shahosov, researcher at Central European University, Emilia Palonen, associate professor of political science at the University of Helsinki, and Jonathan Lomascolo, deputy director of Faith in Democracy. Anton has written several books and articles on Russian and Ukrainian politics and on the radical right. Emilia has published widely on Hungarian and Finnish politics and on populism, and her book, The Birth and Death of Liberal Democracy in Hungary, just came out a couple of months ago, was published by Helsinki University Press. And Jonathan is a scholar, a journalist, and an activist. And in 2023, he edited a book with the title The Christian Right in Europe, Movements, Networks, and Denominations. This is a book that I'm using in my course. Excellent book, I recommend to everyone. So the fact that Anton is not in the room as we planned originally shows that we are indeed in the middle of the Hungarian election campaign. The relationship between the governments of Hungary and Ukraine are so bad at this point that the Ukrainian Minister of Foreign Affairs advised its citizens not to visit Hungary. So this is why we have Anton in Vienna. So let me turn to you first, Anton, and I will ask a question from you, but in a way I asked the other members of the panel to think about that question and then to add anything if they want to at the end of your contribution. So please, Anton, explain to us what the cultural and ideological resources of the Putin's regimes are. And I also wonder, to the extent that this is knowable, whether you could tell us something about Putin's personal beliefs and his conception of history, and how these beliefs and values influence his actions.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Zsolt, and colleagues. Unfortunately, due to circumstances, I'm not able to be here with you offline in Budapest. Well, concerning the question, let me start with saying that um, for Putin, I think the most important thing is probably not the ideology per se. I think what he has is exactly what you said: is personal beliefs that may constitute a worldview, but this is not a real political ideology as we, consider political ideologies or perceive political ideologies in political science. And but still, those beliefs, his worldview is very important for him, and probably in terms of the mythology, in terms of the views that he has on history, it can actually be even more dangerous than having an ideology, because ideology, at least, is something that can be rationalized, and when rationalized, it can also be a subject of criticism, of rational criticism. While mythology, views, personal views, usually they can be irrational, yeah, but they are also much more stable, and they are not necessarily be easy sort of victims of rational criticism. For Putin, and I think it all started actually already during the Cold War, when he was a young student who decided to join the KGB, Soviet Security Services. And at that time, and that we are talking about the 1970s, we're talking about 1975, the year when Putin joined the KGB. That was an interesting time when, on the one hand, the Soviet Union signed the Helsinki Final Act that started the international organization that is now known as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And on the other hand, the Soviet Union tried to minimize the consequences of its signing that Helsinki Final Act that emphasized, in particular, the importance of national rights, of national self-determination. And at that time, the KGB was massively involved in suppressing all those national liberation movements that felt that the signing by the Soviet Union of the Helsinki Final Act somehow legitimized their struggle for national self-determination inside, well, in ethnic national republics in the Soviet Union. And the Ukrainian national liberation movement was one of the strongest in the Soviet Union. And it was that time when Putin became involved in the KGB work. And I think it was at that time that a very important myth formed in his mind. And that myth was that Ukrainian national liberation movement was a conspiracy of the Western enemies of the Soviet Union. And through that Ukrainian national independence movement, the West wanted to weaken the Soviet Union. So that is, in a way, a constitutive myth of Putin's worldview, and one of those myths that eventually led to Russia's war against Ukraine. There is another myth that I am sure Putin acquired or learned already during the Cold War, although perhaps it was also strengthened in the post-Soviet time. That is a myth of the eternal war that the West is waging against Russia in all its historical forms. Either it was an ancient Rus, or it was the Russian Empire, or the Soviet Union, or the post-Soviet Russia. It doesn't matter. In all the historical periods, the West was waging this war against Russia, and Russia was always defending itself from encroachment, from the aggression coming from the West. So these two myths, that the West is waging a war against Russia and using the idea of independent Ukraine as an instrument, as a weapon against Russia in all its historical forms. These are two very important ideas, and I would argue that understanding these two major ideas help us understand Putin's actions. But it's not only Putin. So he does have these ideas, he does have these beliefs, but he also has people around him who perhaps they understand his own ideas, his own views on history, on culture. They feed, they strengthen particular aspects of those beliefs. So he has a person, for example, Vladimir Medinsky, who is for a very long time was in fact one of the Russian chief negotiators with Ukraine. Medinsky is known for his historical revisionist views on the history of Russia, on the history of Europe, and he is one of those people who strengthen this historical analysis or pseudo analysis that Putin has in his head concerning Ukraine, concerning the West. He also has around him people who are were part or still part of the so-called Siloviki circles in Russia. And Siloviki, this Russian term, comes from the Russian word sila, which means power, and Siloviki are members of the various power ministries, starting with the defense ministry, and then counterintelligence and intelligence, etc., etc. Those people who were culturally and socially and politically brought up during the Cold War, and they didn't lose their understanding of or their perceptions of what was happening in the world, and they bring or they strengthen this idea that Putin has himself about this eternal war, yeah, that the West is waging against the Russian Federation. So these two ideas, strengthened by people close to Putin who can actually talk to him, yeah, they become part of this worldview machinery or mythological machinery of the regime, and they kind of empower each other, Putin and those people around him. There are, of course, there is a circle, maybe not necessarily inside the Putin regime as such, so-called, well, not his closest friends, not his closest allies, but rather a circle outside of the Kremlin that deals with propaganda, with media, those people who interpret the ideas or the worldview of Putin and the Kremlin for the domestic audience, for the international audience. So here we can talk about foreign ministry, led by Sergei Lavrov. They have their own interpretation of the developments. They try to use legal terminology, trying to explain very irrational mythology of Putin, so it would be understood by the diplomatic circles. There is a media empire or propaganda empire that uses some other terms, other terminology, to transmit Putin's ideas to the wider public. And then there are those media personalities and academic personalities who do not necessarily influence Putin's views because he already has them, but they add various aspects. For example, the Russian Orthodox Church, they try to interpret what Putin is saying in religious terms. Yeah, so those people for whom religion is important in Russia, although there are not so many of them, but still there are those people who consider themselves Christians, Orthodox Christians, who would rather understand or perceive, or better perceive, more efficiently perceive Putin's ideas if dressed in religious terminology. And then there are people in academia, like Alexander Dugin, for example, who reinterpret Putin's ideology in their own way, in their own ways. Again, for other parts of the domestic and international audience. So it is, in fact, the Kremlin's worldview is a combination of different circles, concentric circles, perhaps even, with Putin in the center. He formulates ideas. They may be very basic, but this is something that he believes in. And then, concentrically, you go to where messages and narratives would be reinterpreted, but still part of this of a bigger worldview machinery or mythological machinery. So this is in a nutshell how this worldview machine looks like in Russia.
Thank you very much. Let me just have one short follow-up question before we turn to the other members of the panel. Does the Orthodox Church support the regime simply because it has always done so and because of its own material interests, or traditionalism and anti-gender discourse is an actual factor that glues together the church and the regime?
No, with the Putin regime, it's very difficult, in fact, to differentiate particular institutions or agencies of that regime from the Kremlin. It is a matter of terminology, like how we define the Putin regime. I would say that the Russian Orthodox Church, it's not really independent in order even to say that it supports the Putin regime. I would say it is part of this regime. Yeah, so it is inclusion in this regime automatically gives an impression that they are, in fact, one of those reinterpreters of what Putin believes in. There are, of course, especially after 2022, especially after the launch of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there were voices inside the Russian Orthodox Church who were very critical of Russia's war, Russia's aggression against Ukraine, but they were immediately driven away from the Russian Orthodox Church, which means that the political decisions of the Russian leadership are also the guiding decisions of the Russian Orthodox Church, which means that the church is not independent. It does not make its own political decisions. It follows the decisions that are taken on the political level.
Thank you. I wonder whether on Russia, you would like to add anything, either of you? If not, then...
I think I agree. I definitely agree that the religious dimension of that is really important and relevant in Russia, and that since 2012 there has been that kind of implementation of the ultra-traditionalist and ultra-far-right idea of the Russian Orthodox Church, namely Patriarch Kirill, into the governmental agenda, and that the ideology Ruskimir, which is driving Russian activism and the war in Ukraine, is inspired by what the Russian Orthodox Church interprets as a religious and a Christian talking point and ideology. And Ruskimir is basically the idea of the great Russian Empire, and it's not, and basically Ukraine is understood at the heartland as the theological heartland of the Russian Empire, and therefore it is impossible that Ukraine is independent from Russia, because it can't be if that's the heartland of the Russian Orthodox theology. And therefore, Ruski Mir and the Russian Empire is often interpreted as kind of the Holy Trinity between Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And so there can't be one without the other two. And that's kind of where we also see how Anton was saying that machinery, ideological machinery, is really nicely tapped and really closely tapped to that discussion in Russia.
Thank you. Since you have,
I could also comment just briefly in a comparative sense that this reminds me of Serbian discourses about Kosovo as well.
yes, Antonio wanted to.
Yes, I would like to just to add, absolutely right that Ukraine is perceived as the inalienable part of the Russian world. I'm originally coming from fascism studies, and in fascism studies we have this sort of approach which is called methodological empathy, which is about trying to understand what the subject of your research truly thinks. You're not sympathizing with the object of your research, but you're trying to understand. So in order to understand this position of Ukraine, the role of Ukraine, the place of Ukraine, and this worldview, it may be, as was mentioned, is at the heart or at the core of this mythology about the Russian world. But we can also imagine the Russian world as a physical body, as a physical human body, and Russia, or the Moscow's understanding of Ukraine, that it is a part of the body. And when Ukraine says, or the West says, well, look, this is a sovereign nation. Yeah, it is independent from Russia. The mythology or mythologists of the Russian world would say, well, this is odd. This is weird. Ukraine is just part of the body. It's like a hand. It cannot be an individual. Yeah, it is just a hand. It is just, it belongs to this body, and unless we're talking about the Addams family, where you have this hand running around, this in the mythology of Russian world, it's just a bizarre thing, and this is exactly why they refer, or they understand the idea of Ukrainian independence as something like a disease. Yeah, it's a disease that affecting a part of the body, and you can either cure this disease or you need to basically get rid of it. Yeah, this constitutes this eliminationist drive that Russia has in Ukraine. It wants to eliminate the disease. This is, and this affecting the body of the Russian world. But it is very true that this holistic view of the Russian world, where Belarus and sort of Greater Russia and then Little Russian, which is Ukraine, it is again also very important to understand how they feel in the Kremlin, how they understand this idea in Moscow.
Thank you. Let me ask Jonathan now to give us in a nutshell the evolution and the character of the Christian right. Maybe also saying a little bit about Hungary, like whether it's present in Hungary, how do you see that? And finally, if you could also say something about the other side, whether there are any spiritual and religious resources that the pro-liberal democracy side could use.
Okay, thank you for the question. I think it's a really wide question. I'll try to keep it kind of to talk about 80 years of the last 80 years in a few minutes. Let's see if I can do that. So basically, the Christian right, as we understand it, kind of started in the 1950s in the US. That's how we often start the conversation with basically white Christian starting to organize not for abortion, but for in order to to continue to fight for the segregation of these schools, because there was a rule that basically everyone had to be divided, white people and black people had to be divided, and that rule was suddenly being outruled, and therefore they started to organize. Later, the topic of abortion came. That was way later. And so they started what we call the Christian right, the moral majority, where there was a strategic collaboration slowly throughout the 60s and 70s between ultra-conservative Christian, especially evangelical and Baptist groups in the US, with the Republican Party. That led to the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, and that continued as a tradition. They built a media empire with talk radio and televangelists, and that led to the election. They built kind of a coalition between ultra-conservative, especially evangelicals, and then mainline and then Catholic later on, and kind of were one of the driving forces for a lot of ultra-conservative politics from the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s. So, but that was not just the US did not just do that within that country, but one thing we shouldn't forget, that obviously the Christian right and ultra-conservative political religious ideas were also exported by the CIA during that time. And especially it was used in South America because they were seeing that Catholic liberation theology was spreading in South America, and they were thinking, oh, that's communism. Liberal liberation theology, that poor people should be cared because of theology or religious belief, that's communism. So we have to stop that. How can we do that? By empowering far-right dictatorships in South America. That's what they did in Europe as well, in Spain, with the Franco regime, and Portugal and Greece as well, where there were still kind of dictatorships for the 60s and 70s. So it was since then, part of the US foreign policy to push ultra-conservative religious ideas as a tool, as a strategy during the Cold War. In Europe, the idea didn't that in Western Europe. I mean, Eastern Europe was a different context, but in Western Europe, all the other countries, it was difficult to push those ideas until the 90s, because there was kind of a Christian democratic consensus after the Second World War that churches understood their responsibility during the interwar and the Second World War, and were more building up Europe. In fact, they are co-responsible for building the European Union. Most of the mainline Protestants and Catholic churches during that time. And so we leave the first phase and come into the second phase in 1990, where we see suddenly different things and a lot of different things that happen at the same time. We have at the UN level, we see a lot of nations that suddenly talk about gender equality as a human right on a UN level. And we see that the Catholic Church, who's always been involved on the UN advocacy level, taking a really difficult stance, a critical stance towards that, and say, all right, suddenly things are changing. People want to integrate gender equality and the rights of women care and health rights into the human rights agenda. Who can we work with in order to broaden our agenda? And so it started a collaboration between the Vatican with US evangelicals, because they were seeing that they had a shared agenda on that. At the same time, obviously, the Cold War ended. And so we had the first meetings between Russian activists and with US evangelical and Christian right activists, and talking about the same shared values they had on family, on God, on patriarchy, on territory, and all these ideas. And so we have the point of the globalization of the American culture war, where we see that they start to pop a lot of transnational Christian right organizations, NGOs, throughout the world, in Europe, in Russia, as well as in the US, that are kind of really transnationally and globally connected. And so when we have two really interesting things. First of all, we have this transnationally. So we have far-right people of far-right ideology that kind of start to collaborate with people from other countries that are also transnational, that are also far-right. And how does that actually work? It works because they agree that there's always someone else who is other of that family. It can be an ethnic. It's after 9/11, obviously the Muslims are, and I'm putting it obviously in quotes, are discovered as the other, and therefore there is a new identity built as the white Western civilization. And then we also see something that has been called an ecumenism of hate, which is basically that everyone of different faiths that did disagree for the last 500 years, because a few of them were Catholics, others were Protestant, and they hated each other for the last 500 years, they couldn't agree on ecumenism. So basically the fringes and the radical fringes of them suddenly came together starting the 90s, not because suddenly they had discovered the theological solution of on how to work together, but they agreed on what they didn't agree on politically, especially on human rights and so on. So we have that kind of ecumenism of hate developing.
But could you tell us who is the author of this phrase?
Yeah, that's Antonio Spadaro. That's he's a Catholic journalist, but also kind of head of communication for the Vatican. He wrote it in a great article 10 years ago describing the US entanglement between Catholics and Protestants. But I think it's something we can see worldwide, actually, that suddenly we have on the same podium Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox talking about the same things and agreeing on everything, on politics, on gender, on who is to blame, which is obviously Muslims and so on. So they share the same agenda. And that's something, and then we have suddenly in the last 10, 15 years, we see the rise of far-right parties. And that's what elevates these groups, these NGOs that have been working in the background. Suddenly they have a strategic partner that they didn't have before. And that kind of elevates both of them into power and gives these often marginalized ultra-conservative Christian groups the power, a political arm and political party that can actually bring their ideas into the mainstream and then into power. And that's what we see kind of a third step coming in the last year. That is, again, a bit different. Suddenly we see that these ideas are so successful that the parties that are part, kind of that build this Christian right, where ultra-conservative religious groups, far-right extremists, and these anti-gender NGOs coming together, these parties get into government and basically take over and push and put into action exactly those policy recommendations that these anti-gender NGOs have built over the last 20 years. We see an institutionalism of these, and that's where Hungary comes in, where we really see that in Hungary has always been a bit different because we didn't have that many NGOs like everywhere in the world. But the Hungarian government has been mimicking, or they have built their own gongos of the goal. So basically governmental organizations that fake themselves as being civil society, but they completely represent the ideology and the program of the party. And so we see that suddenly these NGOs are not that relevant anymore in that cases where the parties are taking over, because they're so successful, they're not needed anymore in that context. And so we see a lot of things happening in the last year. We see, for example, Russia invading Ukraine based on ultra-conservative religious ideology as well, and kind of a mythology, as Anton was saying. We see obviously how that ideology has taken power in the US with Trump, and we see how that has just in the last few weeks also supported the war, or kind of giving support for the attack on Iran, saying that that is a religious war, that's Armageddon, and so on, and how Christian Zionism plays a role as well as part of the Christian right imaginarium. We see the meta-political space, how suddenly we have thread wives online. We see the manosphere, the same thing just for men. We see the next step. So we had a communism of hate, and suddenly we have something like an interfaith of hate, where we see Christian rights politicians meet with Hindu nationalists, and we see them also, and they suddenly can agree on everything because they have again discovered not kind of an interfaith community and sentiment, but they can agree on who to blame everything that is wrong in the world. In that case, Muslims, for example, and obviously gender rights and LGBTQ people and so on. So we see again that there is a wider option. We see again that Israel is also taking part with religious Zionism of this kind of discourse, again, where a grand empire like in Russia, like in India as well, is part of this ideology to expand that. And we see kind of a radicalization of Christian fascism and an open endorsement of these parties by the NGOs. And we also see kind of we see tech bros, how they have not just influence, but taken power of these algorithms and are part of this far-right universe as well. And Hungary has taken and that's incredibly interesting from my point, is not just one small country where this is happening as well. But it's the other way around. Hungary is now a laboratory, a worldwide laboratory, where these ideas are being pushed by the government in an incredibly successful way. And the Hungarian government has spent a lot of tax money, both Hungarian tax money as well as European tax money, in pushing this as part of their foreign and domestic agenda worldwide, supporting a lot of political parties, even bankrolling political parties through one of their partners who owns a bank, who has given loans to the French far-right party or the Italian far-right party. So we see that we used to think, and I'll stop there, we used to think that Europeans and Hungarians were looking at the US and seeing how can we learn from them? What can we learn from the US, what they did, what they're doing successfully since Ronald Reagan, and how can we implement that in Hungary? What we're seeing now is exactly the opposite. The Americans are interested and really interested in the US, and that's why we're going to have CPEC here in 2 weeks, because that's kind of the symbolism of that kind of curiosity about Hungary. The question that the US Christian right activists ask themselves is, how can we continue to be as successful as we drive into an authoritarian system, although we know that our country is increasingly secularized? And so they're looking at Hungary, that is already a really secularized country, and look for solutions here. And so they ask themselves, what is Hungary? What has the government been doing right in using religion to push authoritarian policies that we can adapt in the US, while in the next generation that will be more secularized than they already are? And that's why Hungary is an incredibly important part of this Christian right and religious right universe.
So just a very short question, please be brief.
Sorry.
Basically, repeating this question of mine about whether there are spiritual religious sources for fighting back. Do you see any pushback from churches, religious circles? And the reason why I asked you who is the author of the phrase ecumenism of hate is because even though the Vatican has been there at the beginning of this culture war struggles, that expression also comes from the Vatican.
Yeah.
So maybe you could say a little bit on the other side.
Yeah, I'll take it really short. Yeah. It's taken some time, more than I was supposed to. I think one of the reasons why far-right politicians have been really focused on cracking religion in order to claim to power is because they know how much power there is when people of faith are mobilized. And the same way people of faith can be mobilized in order to drive authoritarianism, they can be driven, and that's what happened in the last century for democratic renewal. We have seen that in the fight against apartheid. We have seen that in the civil rights movement. We have seen that in the Solidarność movement in Poland as well. People of faith have an incredible potential for democracy in their theology throughout all kind of religious tradition. It just has to be tapped, nurtured, and these people have to be supported in order to expand and fulfill their democratic potential.
Thank you. If there is no other comment on this topic from the other members of the panel, then let me turn to Emilia and let me ask you, as someone who knows the history of Hungarian modern politics, what were the discourses, values, identities that were produced by Fidesz, by Viktor Orbán? What was his religious claim, and how this discourse has changed across time?
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and this is exactly the question that I wanted to explore with my book that came out last year, and it's openly available online as well, where I'm trying to see this kind of the way in which parties are building always their discourse with like some sort of us building and what they are against, and this kind of antagonism, populist discourse. I see it being part of kind of like all parties, but particularly intensive in terms of antagonism for the kind of populist parties. This illiberalism that we are discussing today is something that was growing out of Fidesz experience of being first against the regime, like for this new era, then setting themselves as like the party of youth. There are people who know much better about this than me, and I've of course been learning from them as well about the confrontation between generations. And then when you get older, of course, you can't be anymore a party of youth. You have to be party of the like middle-aged people, and there this sort of transformation of Fidesz has been taking place. So here, Fidesz, everybody in Hungary would know, of course, and also abroad, that Fidesz has been moving from a liberal position to this conservative position, where I'm arguing in this book, drawing on some colleagues' work, that there's been a strategic alliance making between Orbán and religious authorities and religious elites, and kind of building networks was really important for Orbán in the early period, where everybody else in Budapest, as he was coming from outside of Budapest, were already connected through other networks. So here he saw, in my view, an opening for strategic alliances and building some networks that other people were not that interested in having. And even if he was not religious himself, he was later converted, then this was a way of addressing what he'd learned from this kind of Gramscian Althusserian thinking of power, that if you have institutional cultural resources, you would be able to get hegemony, remain in power. So this the question that emerged to Fidesz, that had been kind of working on this kind of Polgari identity, this kind of a civic bourgeois, somehow forward-looking and trying to lift this us group into middle classes. And then as he was failing in 2002, and this kind of Polgari project with this kind of embellishment of certain sectors of Hungary was over, then
sorry, for the non-Hungarian, so the term Polgár used to be a very important label of identification for Fidesz, meaning civic and bourgeois.
Yeah, so these people were identifying with this project, or this identifying as well very heavily in 2002. This was a time when I was like hanging out here in Budapest and like seeing on the streets, maybe this year as well, you have been seeing this kokarda on the, that people are carrying the Hungarian national colors on their chest. And that spring 2002 was really surprising to me, as as people were always staring at my chest, and I'm like, why are they staring? But they really wanted to find out whether I'm on the Fidesz side or not Fidesz side. And this was instrumentalized by Orbán. But there was like not really that much more content to the discourse that he had. He had not capitalized that much yet at that point on this religious dimension. But then his question was like how to get back to power, and if and when I get to power, how to remain in power. What could be the legitimate claim to be on power? Well, even in 2002, the legitimate claim was like that the others are illegitimate to rule. That like deep conviction that the others should not be there because they are illegitimate. Unfortunately, this was going both ways. So also the left was thinking that Orbán is not legitimate to rule. And this is why I started theorizing this understanding of polarization. But now that I've been invited to come here, I mean, basically in the book, I was talking about fringe populism, where Orbán is kind of the small one challenging the system. And then there would be competing populism, this polarization, both sides just get their identity from the other side. They don't have to claim for any like political projects and content. It's enough to be saying that the other is illegitimate to rule. Then now Orbán's been in a situation where he's kind of a mainstream populist, rejecting everybody as like marginal. Now, of course, this spring we have very polarized elections again, and there would be more of this kind of two contenders in politics, although you can't really see it here in the Budapest cityscape, interestingly. But when I was asked to talk about this religious dimension, I consulted my colleagues and friends, and then the answer was Orbán, Viktor Orbán, reformator. He is a Calvinist. So to me, this kind of says nothing on one hand, and then I realized that it says everything. I have been consulting here my partner, who is a philosopher of religion, and so my understanding of Calvinism comes from his engagement with this topic, also in the US context, particularly in the US context. But I think this idea of Calvinism, basic ideals and ideas of Calvinism fit really well this hegemony theory. This idea of like there would be an us effectively loaded, and there would be an other. These would be not legitimate to rule. Whereas like those who are on the us side, we have been touched by the Holy Spirit, and we are the legitimate forces to build a Christian society. And if need be, we need to make these unholy alliances with the Catholics and others, as you were just wonderfully explaining in very brief time and so much content. And then here, making these connections, at least for strategic moments in the preparation for this Christian society. That is a buzzword that Orbán keeps on repeating. But of course, the question is like, whose is this Christian society? And previously, I talked about this Polgari, these like middle classes, and this kind of rising up, generating Hungarian middle class that Fidesz saw as failing, as this more advanced people. Let's give funding to those who are with us. For instance, in municipalities that would have Fidesz majorities, etc. Of course, now it's also let's give funding to religious organizations, etc. Always giving funding to our people, maintaining our people. But then, like if you think about Christian ethics as like non-believer like myself, you would think that they would be somehow like more universal. But no, this is a Catholic thinking. For instance, where maybe also Lutheran thinking. Finland is a Lutheran country. We don't really sort of make these distinctions that much. Church is always kind of a church, unless it's an Orthodox church, of course. But the ethical normative questions that might be raised in the moment when you realize that public resources have been given to only some people rather than others, they don't emerge when your belief system is one of this prosperity gospel. So those who are among the believers touched by Holy Spirit and who are among us, they are the ones who have been given. If somebody is somehow advanced, has been successful, they must be touched by Holy Spirit, so they should be given more. And it's only fair. So if you are also like aspiring to be part of them, you might get lucky. If your businesses go well, it's a sign that you have been touched by Holy Spirit or this kind of holy fidesness, and then you would be doing well. So there is kind of hope for those who are like worse off. Like you were saying earlier before we started, and you really know this much better than me, so that is the poorer people who are actually supporting Orbán and Fidesz. But this is potentially the reason why they somehow see these shining carriages or ask how many Ferraris there are in the garage normally, and they see that maybe one day it's also for me. And if they have been doing so well, perhaps they merit it.
Thank you very much. Excellent. I think all three presentations were extremely comprehensive, but also to the point, and help us understand better the context of the election that will happen in a month from now. I have lots of questions here, but I will not ask any of them because I heard that our boss, Andreas Schädler, thinks that we don't leave enough room for questions and answers in this series. So I don't dare to ask them. I rather open the floor for questions to the audience. Yes, please. Could you introduce yourself and speak up?
I try, yeah. My name is Corinne Lockwood. I'm a fellow at the Institute of Studies here. Thank you for this presentation. I was wondering, you didn't talk at all about, for instance, neoliberalism or nationalism, which I think are both very much entangled and will help us to get more complexity here. Because I think, I thought it was a bit of a US story, to be honest. So I think it is, yeah, the US is doing some export here. But I was really curious, like in the wider context of Europe, how does it link, for instance, with the Christian Democrats, another major religious force in Europe, right? So, yeah, I want to ask you for a little bit more elaboration on connections and divisions. Yeah.
Okay, so I think this is something that any of you could address. So either you could focus on the issue of neoliberalism, nationalism, Christian democracy. How can we bring this phenomena into the story? Who would like to?
Well, usually I don't give presentations about religion, but I'm talking about nationalism and maybe neoliberalism. But here they are really entangled. Anton was talking about the myth, the Russian myth of Ukraine. Of course, here in Hungary there would be several nationalist myths that would be replicated. And one of them would be the one where Hungary is safeguarding Europe from the Muslim other. So the civilizationist argument that entangles with nationalism. I've previously been writing about the entanglement of kind of the Janus space of nationalism and populism and their entanglement, and neoliberalism also is part of this picture. I mean, I think what we are talking about on transnational level, which our research groups, researchers are also studying as they are going through the previous CPAC meetings, transcripts and exploring what exactly has been said here. There's a lot of religious content, but there is also a lot of this neoliberal content. And if you talk globally about this phenomenon, Javier Milei in Argentina is of course a key player, and this is a new version of like this Thatcherism, Reaganism that has been there, but is now really invested with this religious undertones that then take. It's more difficult to contest it, maybe.
If none of you want to add anything, then I would like to give the floor to the gentleman there. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. I am Peter Molnar, and I put it a bit ironic. I'm a traumatized founder and former vice president of Fidesz. And I don't call the current party Fidesz. And my question is to Amelia mostly, but be interested in hearing others as well about it, that you mentioned that unfortunately the left or liberal left side of politics, if we put it that way, also thought that Orbán was illegitimate. So it's like both sides found the other. And I see your point, and I think that critical self-reflection on behalf of leftish people, liberal people, left-wing liberals, Greens, and so on and so forth, and liberal conservatives as well, is very, very important. But don't you think that in case of finding the Orbán government sort of illegitimate after they did certain things is very different from how his rhetoric, their rhetoric, just declared that the homeland cannot be in opposition? Because basically that means that only I am the legitimate one, while questioning his legitimacy or denying his legitimacy came, at least to a great extent, after his effective steps to abuse the two-thirds majority and centralize power.
Thanks. Really good question. I'm just wondering whether you are referring to 2002, 2006, or 2010. So in this book, for instance, I have been trying to go quite far back and find these moments where the discourse polarized to the extent that a lot of people also didn't find it very. So I see. I had a lot of friends who did not vote, know whom to vote, because they saw both sides as having similar discourse. But then you are right in saying that there are nuanced differences about seeing like whether the contesting Orbán himself and contesting the whole other part of the regime, or part of the political spectrum as illegitimate. But then the question, the debate never really went into the contents of the political discourses, where we would have been able to then explore more differences. It's always been somehow affectively loaded. And now, as we're today discussing about religion even like tops this affectivity, and it becomes like kind of civic religion, as this kind of belief in Fidesz became. And then it became already in 2002 with a lot of people. And then it starts entangling with this kind of institutionalized religion and the networks that have been formed in this illiberal field. So already the term illiberal assumes that they are the liberals, who obviously not all of them are even liberals, would be illegitimate. But that's been a conceptual innovation of Orbán that's been taken up then by many others, where they don't need to be discussing about the exact contents of that discourse. So maybe I didn't answer your question properly, but I'm still hoping that the Hungarian left and also the Fidesz and former Fidesz people, thanks for joining us with this comment, would be reflecting on what actually did go wrong and how did democracy fail.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, I think Jonathan, you said that people from the US are coming to Hungary to learn how Orban managed to be successful with a religious discourse in a secular society. But I think you didn't tell us, well, how did he? Is it just a cipher for cultural conservatism, or what? How does that work?
Yeah, so basically the idea of I think it's a wonderful question, and of course I didn't answer exactly what so you think the question makes a lot of sense. So the idea model of the religious right, of the Christian right, has always been to tap into religious feelings and belief in the US population, which is really wide, has always been wider than in Western and Central and Eastern Europe, and cultivate that and develop that into a really ultra-nationalist dimension, kind of, and re-understanding that, use the faith, start from the faith, and then build upon that the identity of what it means to be a Christian nationalist. So the approach by European actors and that build the Christian right, the European Christian right, is not to start from belief, but rather from identity. The identitarian modus of the Europeans, how being Christian doesn't mean that you go to church, but it means that you are white, that you are in Europe, that you stand for certain values, whatever that they are. They're not distinctive faithfully, they're not churchy, they're not kind of spiritual in that sense, but it's more about belonging than belief. It's about how do you describe themselves in opposition to the other. And that's kind of the identitarian populist movement we've seen in Europe has built this kind of matrix, this kind of language that is different from the Christian nationalist discourse in the US. And that's why, and with Trump, and that's a really interesting thing, that we suddenly see that Trump actually tapped into that and adapted European identitarian populist language, something that wasn't that prominent in the US before. So he innovated the Christian right in the US by looking at populist, the populist rise in Europe and learning from that. And that's why, again, they're still interested to learn more about that. That's why Tucker Carlson came to Hungary and make a documentary to see how do Hungarian people shop and how does that look like? How does this wonderland look like, where people don't have that many rights like they used to have, but they're still happy, and so on and so forth. And that's why that's the interest, and that's what kind of really, from a US Christian nationalist perspective, is something they try to emulate as well, because they can't kind of reattach with Gen Z and the millennials who are really a part of the nuns in the US, so they don't believe in much in a spiritual sense. They have to try to use that, and that's why we have in the US, for example, build the wall, us versus them. That wasn't that much relevant with Ronald Reagan, who was on certain issues more progressive than that, and that's kind of that's the US if you want so. That's the European influence on Trump.
Alex Polody, I'm a religious affairs journalist here in Budapest. I did have separate questions for Anton and for Emilia, but as Anton hasn't been involved in the questions yet, I'd go for him, and if there's time later, come back to Emilia after other people have a chance. Anton, how significant do you think, in terms of the story of Putin and the Orthodox Church, is his first appointment in the KGB to the 5th Directorate, which also had the responsibility for overseeing the Russian Orthodox Church and monitoring it, but also purposing it as an influence tool in international fora like the World Council of Churches and so on. I'm just struck by the fact that coincidence between being in the 5th Directorate and the later fusion between Putin and the Orthodox Church isn't something that's commented on. I don't know if he was working in the church bit of the 5th Directorate, but I just wonder how important just being in that milieu that early point in his career might have been?
Yeah, I haven't specifically looked at the church involvement in the KGB work, but I mean, what you described is confirmed by other sources, and it also corroborates my own argument that the Russian Orthodox Church is not an independent actor. Although the church and the state are separated in Russia, it may be so, but if we're talking about the other like phenomenon such as the regime, I believe that the Russian Orthodox Church is part of it. It's there is a saying among Russia experts and observers and journalists that the Kremlin as a building, it has many towers, yeah, which is true. And in this sense, the Russian Orthodox Church is one of those towers of the Kremlin. It functions, it operates, or it tries to reach out to those people in Russia for whom Orthodox Christianity is something very important. And it's like with recruitment and mobilization, you cannot mobilize non-religious people by using religious rhetoric, but you can use some other means how you can mobilize them using those emotions that are important for them. So the Russian Orthodox Church, it works with people for whom religious beliefs are important, but they all constitute this ideological or mythological machinery of Russian propaganda.
Thank you.
My question is to Anton as well. I'm Andrea Kidan from the Democracy Institute, and you said basically all these ideas about imperialism and Western imperialism are kind of Putin's personal aligned with his personal opinion, and it's not so much ideology. So you made this separation between personal take and ideological alignment. And I was wondering if that's the case, how comes that you have all across Europe these kind of similar ideas about Western imperialism, gender ideology, and all of that stuff? It's very resonant everywhere. Do you think they all come from Putin's personal take or personal opinion on that direction?
I'm very sorry, I didn't hear the question well. Could maybe Scholz, could you please?
I can repeat, yeah. So you made a distinction between Putin's personal opinion and personal beliefs and ideology, and you said a lot of what is happening in Russia has to do with Putin's personal beliefs and opinions on things. And nonetheless, you see very similar ideas all across at least Eastern Europe, but I would say beyond, not just Eastern Europe, this kind of Western imperialism and ideological threat coming from the European Union and all of that we don't want to see, and so on. So do you think this is all coming from Putin, or is there some other explanation of why we all have the same kind of phenomenon across Europe?
No, absolutely. We hear these messages, we hear these narratives coming from across the world, yes, and something that that is very dear to Putin, this criticism of globalization and Western so-called imperialism and many other illiberal ideas, which are illiberal at their core. You can hear not only from Putin, obviously, but also from, say, the European far right or the American far right. I don't think that the origins of those ideas lie with Putin. No, his propaganda machine is simply amplifying what is already there, and it is I wrote also a lot about political warfare. That Russia, in particular, that Russia is waging against the West and Europe, And in political warfare, you don't necessarily have to create new narratives. You're simply finding those narratives in your target country that align with your own ideas, and you amplify them. Because it's always it's more efficient to use those instruments of which are domestic, which are natural. Yeah, you're not bringing anything new to that target country. You're nurturing, you're amplifying what's already there, and those ideas, of course. Even if we look at how Putin frames this entire discussion about global world, global rules, he started promoting those anti-globalist agenda when he realized that the globalization does not necessarily work for his interests and for the interests of the Russian Federation. So he's in fact quite flexible in his criticism, and probably you've heard the more recent declarations coming from the Kremlin and Putin himself, that he frames the American war against Iraq as the violation of the international order, international rules, despite the fact that, of course, the Russian Federation itself contributed to that destruction of the international post-war international order. So Putin and the Kremlin, they are quite flexible, and today they are supporting the far right. The US is now supporting the European far right as well, as we have seen in recent months, and it will continue. But again, it's not necessarily coming, or the ideas or the techniques or tactics are not necessarily coming from Putin. They can be quite native.
Thank you. Please.
Please.
My name is Marcus Brand. I'm a constitutional lawyer from Vienna. And first of all, thank you very much for the really interesting debate. I have one question that relates to historical precedent and legacies, and that is the particular history of the Central European countries during the interwar era, during which, for example, in Austria, we had our own species of what we call clerical fascism. Poland, later Slovakia, also Hungary, certainly Southeast European countries had their own special brands of that. And I wonder to what extent you see any linkages between what's going on in Central European countries, especially now, and in these countries in the 20s and 30s of the 20th century. I'm surprised that this has not been mentioned as an example, as a reference, because I think that as much as some of the Cold War legacies and maybe some American influences are also there, but there may be something actually much more homegrown in our region in Central Europe that we kind of subconsciously maybe even refer to, and a lot of that may have also be maybe connected with territorial irredentism and things like that. In Hungary, this is of course a special case, but in the 20s and 30s, I remember reading about chauvinism or parochialism and this kind of particular type of mindset that is different from the more, let's say, secularist ideology the Nazis or the fascists in Italy were promoting. Maybe can you just maybe mention whether there is any it's worth exploring those historical roots in our particular Central European region?
I go really briefly on that. So yeah, I think it's a great point. I started with the 50s in the US. I could have started with the interwar, but then it would have taken even more time. So please excuse me, and I didn't mention that explicitly. Yeah, I think one of the things we're seeing in the last 5 years is that there is more reference. So as these movements are going from kind of Christian radicalism into kind of something that's been labeled Christian fascism as well, we're seeing kind of a return and more quoted authors of that time, Konservative Revolution, the Austrian-German kind of movement, but also the fascist Italian collaboration and the interwar times. That's something, people and ideas that are being brought back right now. That's kind of the latest, the last 3-4 years, something we've seen. And as for the territory, I think Hungary is, or Orbán in one of his speeches in the last years has also mentioned that he is kind of, he was talking about Germany. I remember the speech, and Mariette van der School in her book, Faces of Christianism, kind of tells the story, where he basically says Germany was allowed after the 1990s to reunite. Why are we Austrians not allowed to reunite as well? And he's obviously talking about the Carpathian Basin and so on. He's not kind of asking to change the borders. He's not going there, but he's stepping just a step from it. He's kind of stopping just a step from there. So these are both the interwar clerical fascism in Austria as well as in Germany and so on is coming back. And as well, the secularization of territory is something really shared in those ideologies in Russia and Hungary and in other religious nationalist ideologies and nations as well.
That's a great question. I think this peasant populism of the 30s is much present still today and has been in these discourses that when I started studying Hungarian politics, I actually studied street names and memorials and political myths. That was my first topic, and then I changed to this polarization. In the book, I'm talking about the role of Fidesz in, for instance, Fidesz discourse and the way in which Budapest the Budapest is contrasted with the countryside. Maybe now it's not as in the situation of hegemony, it's not as much emphasized anymore, but the ideas that one draws from the kind of post-Civil War era are still present here. And 4 years ago, the election campaign was dominated by a memory of the Trianon Treaty that was celebrated, so mourned officially for the year before. So when people were asking me elsewhere why are Hungarians not seeing a parallel between this 56 revolution and the Soviet tanks moving in, then I explained to them that if there is something in this myths that Anton was also talking about that would be coinciding with the loss of territory. So their sympathies were for many on the side of Russians in this situation where still today there are Hungarian-speaking minorities in western parts of Ukraine. And this is, as we all know, still affecting the campaigns here. How is it like tied to them to religion? And these questions, I'm not exactly sure, but of course there are some underpinnings. And I also worry about anti-Semitism, precisely coming from this dichotomy between Budapest and the countryside and this kind of anti-metropolitan discourses that would be there. But I mean, now there is control to some extent in cities, although of course Budapest mayor is of a different. There's actually some chapter about the previous long-serving Budapest mayor in the book.
Gabor
Demszky.
Yes, please.
My name is Rajshri Chandra. I teach at Delhi University. I teach political science, and I'm here at the Institute of Advanced Studies on a visiting fellowship, and I'm working on the aesthetics of democratic authoritarianism. That's my project, more specifically on the aesthetics of the Hindutva regime. And for those who do not know, Hindutva is a conjugate term of Hinduism, and it specifically distinguishes itself from Hinduism because it is pretty agnostic about the core religious beliefs of Hinduism per se. And Jonathan, this is where I wanted to plug into the point that you made about how religion is trying to coexist or trying to plug in along with secularization of society. the Hindutva regime presents one of the core critiques of the caste system, which is sanctioned by Hinduism. And in that sense, I sometimes feel that secularization of religion itself becomes an aesthetic with which democratic authoritarian regimes reach out to people. So it kind of pitches into the core religious aspects that are probably non-democratic or discriminatory, tries to secularize them, and hence uses religion to in a sense that is more political and that is more aesthetic rather than religious per se. So that is the, and I had one question for Anton, which is that you spoke about methodological empathy. If you could just speak a little bit more about that.
I wanted to say that this is a really great point. I have a student working on her master's thesis on Hindutva music videos, actually, and the anti-Muslim message in them. And it becomes kind of part of the everyday. So you're really having a perfect topic there.
Yeah, and the parallels are there. You're right, and I mentioned that before. And it's not just, they share the same playbook and they share best practices. They are really, I mean, that's kind of the thing. I was on I participated just kind of on a conference in Istanbul where there were basically both Christian right activists from Europe that in Germany are talking about against Muslims, and they were in Istanbul talking with Muslim ultra-conservative part of this kind of this, with the same ideology, and they were sharing, and they were all right with everything because they were sharing about the importance of patriarchy and of order and of role of women who is at home. So there is, you know, it was surreal, definitely, but they say exactly, but they were sharing the same panel because they were agreeing on that, and they were stopping on that. They weren't talking about how in Europe Muslims were being treated. So we're seeing exactly the same thing when Orbán with meets Modi in India, and Trump as well, and they all are happy and together because they share. They are
best friends.
They're best friends because they don't share. It's not about religion, as you were saying. It's about politics and how to use that in order, just as a veneer, so to speak, in order to push their authoritarian rules and laws.
Just as a bit of trivia, I've been here for a week, and as I drove in and over the week, I have not seen one poster, one hoarding with Orbán's face. You enter Delhi, and you see Modi staring at you, looking at you, gazing at you from every hoarding, every poster, every certificate, every magazine possible. So in that sense, the idea of power needing to look visually good is very, very dominant. And I feel that India perhaps is a laboratory case for
Modi is the most followed politicians on TikTok and Instagram, and that's for a reason. Yeah.
Anton?
Yes, what I meant by methodological empathy, I'm not an inventor of this term. It's quite simple. It is an approach of understanding others, understanding ideologies of others, especially if you're not aligning with those ideologies or maybe critical of ideologies, but understanding those ideologies or phenomena from the perspective of those people for whom those ideologies are their own. So just a very, since I mentioned fascism studies, it is in some circles, in academic circles and journalistic circles, expert circles, it was, especially in the past, it was quite common to describe fascism as a reactionary ideology. Yeah, but methodological empathy applied to the study of fascism would take the claims of fascists saying that they were or are revolutionaries. So the methodological empathy would take this seriously and not describe them as a reactionary, but as a revolutionary. Say the classical definition of fascism as a kind of revolutionary ultranationalism is based on this approach of methodological empathy.
Thank you very much, Anton, Emilia, Jonathan. Thank you for your great contribution, for the fascinating discussion. Usually these events continue outside of the room. There is some wine, so except Anton, everybody else will be able to enjoy the wine. Please join me in thanking our speakers. The next session, when do we have the next one?
Next Monday on Russian interference in the Hungarian election in Hungary.
Okay, so Anton, maybe as a part of the audience, you could join us.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you.